Good evening, welcome. My name is Peter Christian Agner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. It's my pleasure to welcome you all back here tonight. If this is your first time with us, I invite you to learn more about the Gotham Center online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find hundreds of podcasts, recorded interviews, panel discussions, original essays, book reviews, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a more in-depth learning experience may also be interested in our new online education program, Gotham Ed, offering mini courses with leading experts and scholars on a wide range of topics at convenient prices and convenient times and friendly prices. You can see our current menu at gothamed.com. With that said, I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening, who will be discussing this excellent new book from Oxford University Press entitled The Long Crisis, New York City and the Path to Neoliberalism. We're not short on accounts by historians as to what brought on the neoliberal age, as it's called, but the dominant narrative within the profession has been a triumph of conservatism, either imposed by economic elites from above or driven by social forces from below at the national level. Tonight's author challenges and complicates this story, arguing that in America's largest and most liberal city, it was grassroots actors with little allegiance to market ideology who fueled the rise of private sector solutions for public sector problems in the late 20th century. Quote, far from bit players during an era often portrayed by historians as one of conservative dominance, Ben Holtzman argues, Democrats and liberals were fundamental to the market turn, unquote. But while some of those figures embraced business over government from the start, Holtzman also presents this turn away from the New Deal liberalism of the mid-century as in many ways a tale of unintended consequences or making do. Struggling to maintain social services and improve very distressing conditions in a time of crisis and austerity, bloc associations, neighborhood groups, philanthropies, and professional associations in New York City steered, quote, a process of popular marketization, as Holtzman argues, that transformed the political economy from the ground up. But they experimented, he insists, overwhelmingly, and did not necessarily want the outcomes that resulted. A general dependence on business and the nonprofit sector to address problems that we know from comparative international research are usually far more efficiently managed by government. While the popular refrain in the media has been of New York's comeback, quote, from the dark days in the 1970s fiscal crisis, we also know that New York has become once again the most unequal city in America over the past few decades, as income and wealth in the US have stratified to Gilded Age levels. And there is a sad irony in this fact, since New York was also the birthplace of the New Deal, that set of governmental policies that arguably did more to level inequality and fuel mass prosperity than any force in US history, save war. In the years after World War II, New York remained that kind of city with its own, quote, homegrown version of social democracy, a larger share of public benefits than one can find anywhere else in the nation. But that city is gone. And Holtzman's book forces us, I think, to consider that in reclaiming it, our biggest challenges might also be right here at home. So without saying any more, allow me to introduce our speaker. Benjamin Holtzman is an assistant professor of history at Lehman College in the Bronx, part of the City University of New York, where he teaches courses on modern US and New York history. Previously, he was a lecturing fellow at Duke University. His research has appeared in Modern American History, the Journal of Social History, the Journal of Urban History, and several edited collections. It has been supported by fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is currently working on a second book entitled Smash the Klan, Fighting the White Power Movement in the Late 20th Century, which examines the activist network that took root in Atlanta, Durham, and Louisville, and other cities during the late 1970s and 1980s to combat the national resurgence of white supremacist organizing. For several decades, he's also been involved in various grassroots projects for political and economic change around issues such as foreclosure prevention, queer and trans rights, youth empowerment, incarceration, and graduate worker rights. I'm very happy to welcome him here to the Gotham Center. And it's my distinct pleasure as well to introduce our discussant this evening, John Krinsky. John is professor of political science at City College and the Graduate Center, also within the City University of New York. He specializes in urban politics, the politics of social movements, and the politics of work, welfare, and labor. He is a co-editor of the online peer-reviewed journal Metropolis, co-editor of the journal Social Movement Studies, and the co-author of Who Cleans the Parks? Public Work and Urban Governance in New York City, as well as the author of Free Labor, Work, Fair, and the Contested Language of Neoliberalism. He coordinates the Politics and Protest Workshop at the CUNY Graduate Center and is a founding board member of the New York City Community Land Initiative. It's my distinct pleasure to have him here as well. I'm going to turn things over to Ben now, who's going to provide a brief overview of his book before John leads us in conversation. But first, the usual bit of housekeeping. As always, discussion will last until about 7:30 or so, at which point we'll take your questions. We are disabling the chat function in Zoom out of respect to our speakers, but I encourage you to send in questions at any time during the conversation using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So with that, please join me in welcoming our guests with a little bit of silent applause.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Peter, and thanks as well to the Gotham Center for inviting me and for organizing this event. I'm really grateful to the Gotham Center for all of the exceptional work that they do in championing New York City's history. I use it for my research. I use it for my teaching. I've attended events. It's really important to the city, and I'm really grateful and appreciative of the work they do, and to be able to be a part of an event that is put on. So I'm grateful for all the labor that went into all of this. And thanks also to John at the start. Although we hadn't met until recently, I was really already familiar with both his scholarship and his long involvement in New York activism and politics. And so I was really happy to see that he agreed to be a part of this conversation. And thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Thursday night, especially as these days are getting longer and a little bit warmer, and choosing to be here when one could be outside having some whiskey. Or maybe you're doing both, I suppose. But anyway, thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to start off with an overview of the long crisis for about 5 minutes to expand a little bit on what has been said. So the project explores the origins and implications of one of the major political developments of the last 50 years, the increasing reliance on the market and private sector for realms of urban life that had principally been the domain of government. This is a shift that has occurred across the world, from privatizing water systems to spreading private security on public streets. The growth of the market and private sector across public life has led to major changes in local and national governance in the US and across the world. When I began this project, historians of the United States who have been kind of thinking about these changes had really overwhelmingly portrayed this shift as being a result of the rise of the political right in the late 20th century. So scholars have really depicted the growth of market policies as deriving from the work of conservative politicians, as well as the business sector, libertarians, and free market economists. So in the long crisis, I took a different approach. I wanted to examine this transformation through the experiences of New Yorkers on the ground, by focusing on how they're both affected by and ultimately reshaped the political and economic conditions of the city. I tried to ask what it would mean to think about the growth of market policies, not as coming simply from powerful national figures who were clearly driven by pro-market ideologies, but as a process that unfolded locally by residents and democratic officials in New York, including those who very often had lacked any kind of particular proclivity towards market solutions. And New York is an especially notable setting for this transformation, this broad shift from government to market, because it was for decades at mid-century recognized as having the strongest tenets of social democracy and government-centered solutions in the United States. But as I trace in the book, by the 1960s, the city entered into a prolonged period of economic decline. This led to accompanying constraints on municipal budgets that began to slowly shift what New Yorkers believed government could provide. I trace how, as a result, beginning in the late 60s, New Yorkers launched imaginative remedies to local crises that an economically battered municipal government seemed unable to solve. I trace how New Yorkers embraced an ethos of volunteerism and eventually a partnership with private business to sustain key areas of urban life. I also examine how liberal and democratic policymakers of the 70s and 80s came to see such alliances not as stopgap measures, but as legitimate and ultimately permanent features of modern governance, moving the city away from mid-century institutions of liberal government and toward a greater dependence on the private sector and market. I show how local Democrats and liberals navigated changing economic conditions by supporting a variety of initiatives bubbling up from within New York that turn toward private and market solutions. So in the book, I focus especially on what I call livable spaces. So these are especially ones that are connected to housing and public spaces. And I did that because these areas seem to me to be really central to city residents' lives, where they live, where they sought comfort, and where they interacted with loved ones. And there are also spaces that provoked particular alarm as they declined in ways that municipal government alone seemed no longer able to fix. So throughout the book, I detail how New Yorkers responded to these conditions by developing new solutions to the problems affecting these livable spaces. These came from city dwellers who often professed little ideological allegiance to market solutions, but whose actions nonetheless pushed the city in that direction. So some examples. So there were, for example, activists who sought to improve access to affordable housing by emphasizing self-help and individual ownership over government resources, which I look at in the first chapter. There were also residents who came together to improve the deteriorating conditions in municipal parks through newly formed groups that were dedicated to volunteerism and private donations. Another chapter examines how residents grew concerned with growing crime and began to advocate for private actors, whether guards or their own community groups, to begin to patrol city streets, which I trace in chapter 4. So through these various examples, the long crisis is attempting to offer a new kind of origin story for the market turn in the late 20th century. Rather than emerging simply from the right side of American politics, the book aims to show how the growth of the market and private sector came from a far more homegrown and experimental process that was shepherded by New Yorkers who were driven to improve local conditions. The book also tries to think through some of the consequences of what this shift meant, and in many ways continues to mean for New York. So great. So that's the overview.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ben, and thanks again to Peter and to the Gotham Center for organizing this. I should just say to all of those of you who've joined us that this is an extraordinarily good book. It's a book that, first of all, is just beautifully written, and in its real sort of eloquence, and it conveys this argument, I think, with actually some urgency, and the urgency that I think that it has, and this gets really very evident toward the end, is it asks us to really think about what we're doing now about inequality and what kinds of frameworks we're engaging to meet the inequality that has really exploded in the neoliberal era, so that we can think about also whether or not what we're doing is likely or not to have even worse consequences later on. I think there's a kind of subtext there that is really important, because after all, as Ben said, he's accounting for a lot of grassroots work, not all of it grassroots, but a lot of grassroots work to preserve and create livable spaces. And I love the term livable spaces in the city under threat. And part of the hallmark, I think, of the neoliberal era is this idea of constant crisis, so that there's always a threat that justifies the austerity that makes these spaces less and less livable. So what do we do about it? And there's a certain kind of, there's an element to Ben's argument that says it doesn't actually matter, or it may not matter, what your ideological orientation is. It's really sort of how your work is carried into the future. So it's incumbent on us to learn from the past. And I think that's a very strong message, I think, that comes out in the book. I want to start out by asking, maybe if you can say, and this is also something I should just say may come out of being in the social sciences rather than being in history disciplinarily, because in the social sciences you'll often get workshops where somebody says, well, what if I don't care about New York from the 1960s until today? What if I really care about Curitiba, Brazil? What can I learn from this? Right? It's always, what kind of a case is this? So, but I want to ask a slightly different question than that, which is, what kind of a story is this? And I think one could read it as a story of basic historical irony and contingency, right? One could read it as the final unraveling of the New Deal coalition that united leftists of various stripes with old line moneyed progressives, in which the latter finally peeled off into the more elite driven and neoliberal politics they embraced 100 years ago. And I think, or rather the more elite driven politics that they embraced 100 years ago, which now in its revivified form seems more like neoliberalism. And I think Bloomberg may fit this mold well. I always thought of him as a 19th century progressive. One could read it as well as a story in which capitalist logics just gobble up everything good, even those things that people do to mitigate the effects of capitalist crises. It could also be a story of the 68 generation's concern with autonomy, community control, and suspicion of inauthentic bureaucracies, sort of changing their political stripes, and resulting in something very different a generation and half a generation later than what all of that autonomy, community control, and suspicion of inauthentic bureaucracy started out as. So my question is, which of these stories is the right story? Are all of these the right story, or some of them the right story? How do you think about what the sort of larger story being told is?
Yeah, so great question. I really appreciate all of that framing that you did there. And I would say, without sounding kind of too broad in terms of what a book is trying to accomplish, I think that there are elements of most of those stories in the book. And I don't think that those stories are in conflict with one another. I think that they're happening simultaneously. So a lot of what you laid out, I think that those elements are there within the book. I'm going to hone in on a couple of them. So one would be, I see this book less as, I'll hone in on sort of what the book is saying about the Democratic Party and liberalism. And I see the book as less necessarily talking about the end of something like neoliberalism or the end of traditional Democratic Party politics from the earlier in the 20th century, but it is certainly about the transformation of liberalism, and certainly about the transformation of the Democratic Party out of the New Deal liberal era, roughly going from the 1930s into the 1970s and undergoing a transformation that I think that actually in many ways we can see most clearly within cities like New York. It takes more time, in my view, for it to kind of filter up to a kind of national politics. But we see a Democratic Party that increasingly emphasizes that moves away from traditional solutions like social welfare provisions, and kind of looking to the state to fill in the kind of gaps and holes within capitalism, right? To moving more towards looking toward the private sector and market, and that being a transformation that I'm trying to examine is first we see sort of elements through it, during the era of John Lindsay, moving that into the 1970s under the tenure of Abraham Beam, and really taking form under Ed Koch. As Koch is just this sort of unequivocal kind of pro-market orient, pro-private sector. We need to reduce the responsibilities of government, and we need to move as much as we can onto the private sector and market. And I think that that's a transformation that we will then see exhibited more and more at the federal level under someone like Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and his movement towards enterprise zones as a response to poverty and those kinds of things. And actually, this is now just chronicled extremely well in Lily Geismer's new work about the transformation of the Democratic Party in the late 20th century. So that's I think one element. I think that element of unintended consequences that you also touched on is also a part of the book. I mean, part of showing the ways that or one of the emphases in the book, for those who haven't read it, a key dynamic of a dimension of the book is trying to show how at least one element, one crucial and often overlooked element of this market turn was how people within their communities were responding to economic decline, constricting municipal budgets and trying to preserve those services, right, by volunteerism, private sector donations and parks, those kinds of things, right? Moving away from what seems like what the state can provide towards other kinds of solutions that rely increasingly on private sector, private actors, those kinds of things, right? And that very often those led to a kind of unintended consequence that those weren't meant to be permanent solutions, right, by many of the people who were undertaking them. But over time, due to a variety of factors, which we can, of course, talk about, that they become really heralded as the solutions for urban governance in New York and ultimately really across the country. And I'll wrap this up here, but those are the two that do really stand out. I think it's interesting to talk about the element of, you mentioned the sort of capitalist logics just kind of gobbling everything up. And I think that there's elements of that too, but I think, one thing that the book is also trying to show is that these processes are always contested, right? They're always contested. And one of the things that was really important to me to do in the book, even if I'm chronicling more failure than success, is to also show the ways that throughout this 1970s, 1980s, that there were people who were trying to steer city policy towards more equitable solutions. They don't often succeed, and that kind of speaks to some of the dynamics under which they're working under capitalism. But that's an element of the story too.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I was just before we started, I was saying to Ben that I found one figure, and he appears only a few times in chapters on development and on homelessness in the book. But there was a figure who actually would later become my boss in a big nonprofit in New York, the Community Service Society, where I worked for a couple of years in the mid-90s, who in the Koch administration was in charge of the sort of homeless services coordination. And it's this very, and partially because his name stood out to me, and I said, oh, there's Larry, but Lawrence Klein, who kept trying to push the Koch administration to reform a certain tax incentive to refurbish apartment buildings, and called the J51 program, which was resulting in the owners of single room occupancy hotels converting those to luxury housing. And we lost something like 100,000 units or more of single room occupancy hotels in New York. And it coincided, unsurprisingly, with the rise of mass homelessness. And there's this, it's extremely poignant in the book, how you see this figure trying very, very hard to push back from within the Koch administration against this, and really, I mean, getting ignored, completely ignored. And it's important, I think, because it shows the way that these processes were contested both within the administrations and outside the administrations. And certainly, you know, there's no shortage of urban theory. I mean, the journal Antipode 20 years ago did a special issue on what they called really existing neoliberalism. And there were several contributions, including by the geographer Jamie Peck and Adam Tickell, and then by an urban theorist named Bob Jessup, that talked about how we should expect this process to really be a process. So there's no thing called neoliberalism that you end up with at the end. That there's also a lot of local variation and hybridity. So Jessup talks about the tendency of neoliberal policies to elbow out neo-communitarian policies, neo-corporatist policies, neo-statist policies, but for those to actually coexist in fact. And I think we see a lot of that in Ben's account. But there's an important question about sort of when all of this sort of turns, and sort of how, I guess maybe my question would be, is there a way that you think that your story ought to be periodized, so that there's maybe a point at which we don't have what you would call neoliberalism, and then a point where you do. You mentioned the Koch administration, but they don't completely succeed in this either, necessarily.
Yeah, no, a really great question. So one of the things, just in terms of periodization and kind of the way that I was approaching the book, one of the things that I was trying to do, particularly as, you know, my discipline is history, so I think about these things in a particular kind of way, but I really wanted to end the book with sort of et Giuliani. I mean, I necessarily know that at the beginning, but at a certain point, it was clear to me that that it made sense to really show, and because, you know, Rudy Giuliani, by so many scholars of neoliberalism, or as of the kind of neoconservative turn, people who are thinking about New York politics, really highlight his tenure as the quintessential moment. Increasingly, there's been work, you know, by Jonathan Sofer and others who have really brought this back more to the Koch administration and have really showed how some of these dynamics were at work in earlier administrations, for sure. But that then, and to some extent still now, Giuliani really was heralded. So part of what I was trying to do is to show how so many of the things that become sort of championed by Giuliani, or both championed by Giuliani as necessary steps to, you know, privatize, to you know, offload to the private sector and market, that in many ways those sort of wheels were turning and very much already moving forward in that direction for decades. And that he is really only able to succeed in many of those elements and usher in what, if we want to think of that as the kind of neoliberal turn in New York, that is only able to succeed in the way that he did, in the extent that he did, because there is this deeper history of several decades of legwork. So I think that as a kind of ending point made sense, and that's, you know, even if we kind of still think of the periodization as in many ways, you know, Giuliani still representing something very significant in the city's history, which absolutely he did, that there was this longer history that had these processes churning. So, I mean, you know, as a historian, I should have something very precise to say about periodization, but I mean, to me, it is a kind of longer process that is at work, and so some of this, what I really chart back to, is some of the, the economic crisis that unfolds in New York that really begins in the late 1960s. So, to really begin the story, if one endpoint is Giuliani, or if an endpoint is Giuliani, that the beginning point wasn't Giuliani, wasn't Koch, wasn't the fiscal crisis, but actually begins many years before that, to really show how even in more recent literature, where the fiscal crisis has also become this quintessential moment for people who are charting the neoliberal turn, which it is, to really think there too about how some of the ways in which some of the dynamics that we consider to be, again, sort of part of this move toward the market and private sector in New York, were also at work in various communities and in various processes, really heating up in the late 1960s when the city really enters into some serious economic decline, where we see a real stagnation in terms of municipal budgets. So I don't know that that's a precise answer to your question, but I think it hits on how the book is trying to think a little bit differently about some of the common periodizations of this history.
No, actually, I love it. I'm somebody, from the social sciences, to get a historian say I should have something precise to say about periodization, but I don't, is actually lovely. It's lovely to hear, because I think actually, part of the question is your period changes depending upon what your lens is. And how closely you're looking. The dynamics on the ground look a little bit different from the heights of municipal finance, for example. And of course, one could go back. I mean, you're offering a very kind of bottom-up look, and sometimes I think maybe you sort of bend the stick a little too far. Because there's always like Robert Fitch in the back of my head with, David Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family trying to manipulate city policy to save their real estate holdings, really in a lot of ways from the 20s forward. And among those things was to remake the West Side, to try to move the port functions of New York to New Jersey, which did happen eventually, and the first container ship sails from the port of Newark in '56. And that, of course, changes. I mean, one could say that's the beginning of the end right there, right? And it's part of an even longer project. It's part of almost, by that time, a 60-year project. But it raises, I think, a couple of other kinds of questions for me. One is, just when Giuliani was taking power, or coming into power, or maybe slightly after, I'm trying to remember, a longtime sort of housing activist who was active in the Bronx, named Harry DiRienzo, who helped found a group called Banana Kelly. And has been very active. He's still active. Wrote an article in the journal City Limits, a viewpoint piece called Managing the Crisis, where he described the community development sector, this nonprofit community development sector that really grew out very much of the citizen initiatives around housing that you described, as managing the crisis, as basically having developed, so professionalized and developed their own expertise around housing that they lost touch with the tenant fights that would be necessary to restart under Giuliani. And he says that's where the housing movement's gone. The housing movement has professionalized, it's managed the crisis. Now, it's important, though, that I think, I mean, I can't say what Harry would say, but I think it's not about popular marketization at all, though, because that I would think that you would want to have a distinction between housing that is nonprofit, that remains actually quite affordable to people in neighborhoods, preserving livable spaces. And that turn only happens under Giuliani, where city policy is really oriented away from the nonprofit sector and providing affordable housing, and all of these for-profits start being brought in. And that's been the case from Giuliani through de Blasio. And I imagine it will continue to be the case for a while. But I think there's a real difference there. And I think you would have to mark the difference. But the mechanism that Di Rienzo is saying is that we're actually doing our job fairly well, but we're no longer a movement. And that's going to come and bite us in the tush, right? And but it's also very different from saying it's providing a kind of ideological justification. And so I think that there's a kind of disagreement there with your analysis. And I wonder how you would sort of think about those distinctions.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I think I would take the point if there was somebody who maybe I shouldn't say these things, but if there's somebody who did feel like I was sort of bringing too many things under a kind of banner, I would understand that perspective because I'm not looking at a single phenomenon in New York, and part of why I used the word marketization, which is a clunky word, and I sort of use the term popular marketization to make it, thanks to Brett Siebel, who's a historian at Penn, who suggested that, to make it sound a little less clunky. But nonetheless, to reflect the fact that I'm looking at several different kinds of processes. So in some cases, it's outright privatization. So literally the movement from a city service that gets fully adopted by a private company or nonprofit or what have you, or the growth of private-public or public-private partnerships, or the increasing reliance on nonprofits, and those are different things. And I do take the point, and I try to be careful in the book to distinguish how those dynamics play out and why those differences matter and why they are ultimately about a larger process. But I take the point that they are different, and I think that that's real. And I think that with the question of housing, that's particularly the case, because so one of the things I'm charting with my chapter on low-income housing is what you're describing, this sort of growth, a couple different elements, but one dynamic of it is the move towards nonprofits really playing a greater role in the development of housing. Part of that is to show some larger shifts. So part of that is to show a larger shift from an era of actual public housing, not that public housing goes away, but the federal disinvestment from increased public housing that's actually state-owned towards housing that is increasingly managed, run, operated by nonprofits, right? And that's an important shift in terms of the dynamic of low-income housing. Simultaneous low-income housing increasingly gets linked in the 1980s and through till today, ever more so, to the development of market rate housing, oftentimes undermining the ultimate need for you're developing all of this market rate housing that is pricing people out, and then you're through that developing a small percentage of low-income housing for the way that these processes are set up. So those dynamics are different than what had existed in the past, and I think significant. And there too, one other sort of element that I'll add here is to also think about exactly what you're describing, how a lot of that sort of shift from what in a lot of housing activists' minds was a vibrant grassroots housing movement that develops one of these sort of unknown or relatively unknown vibrant social movement of the 1970s. We think of the 1970s being this sort of, in many ways, especially in the latter half, being a kind of dead period. There's this extraordinary movement for low-income housing that develops in the 1970s. By the 1980s, through a variety of processes, that increasingly becomes one that is filtered into these nonprofits. And activists at the very beginning of that process are bemoaning that. Some of them like it because of the good work that they are able to do. under that model of sort of non-profitizing or creating greater nonprofit involvement in the creation and management of low-income housing. But many of them are also calling attention to sort of the same dynamic that you're describing that Harry is mentioning in the 1990s of saying, we were able to exert more pressure outside of the system than within. We were able to be more led by people within the community. Now we're increasingly led by bureaucrats. Though we were able to steer away from, in many cases, housing that would be ultimately market rate. That's much less possible. So all of those dynamics. So I take the point. I think it's a good one that is a fundamentally different dynamic in the larger process that I'm shaping than something like outright privatization of a city park or something. But I think that those processes are still important to the larger shifts that are happening in New York and still part of that broader process. And I'll just say one, not to get too in the weeds, but I'll just say one thing. The intent is absolutely not to throw the nonprofit housing movement under the bus. I mean, I think that at the time and since that it's incredible work that takes place. But I'm charting a sort of historical shift that I think is sort of a dynamic that even people at the time were they felt it was a kind of pacifying of the pacification of the movement, and I think there's some truth to that.
I mean, I think that's right. I think even people who are in the nonprofits recognize that frequently,
right?
As Harry did.
Right.
I wonder though whether some of the difference around housing, and I also hope not to get too far in the weeds, but housing is the focus of a lot of my life. There's one can talk about public housing and the withdrawal of public housing, but that didn't start locally, right? That comes from the federal government, and it also is the fact that most of the housing that people live in New York is privately owned. So these dynamics around housing are not exactly a dynamic about something that was really mostly or primarily in the public sphere being, and a government responsibility being wrenched out of the government and privatized. It is a slightly different dynamic. And I think that it's important to sort of, I think, emphasize that. I think that it's fairly clear in your book, but I think it's important that's emphasized. But I also wanted to know, just as long as I'm on the sort of splitting rather than lumping kind of set of questions, there's if we're going to distinguish between something like housing and something like parks privatization, and of course, even within parks privatization, there's a lot of variety. So that you have something like the Bryant Park, which is almost completely privatized and is able to keep 100% of the concession money that it generates, which also incentivizes it to devote more and more of the park to concessions. And something like Friends of Brook Park or something in the Bronx, that are reclaiming a park space and making it livable in a way that it never was before. Again, some similar dynamics. You have the city itself, and this is something that I think is a fascinating problem or conceptual issue. The city itself is putting a lot of effort into organizing private initiative. So when it moves, and I think one of the great things about this book is just this idea that there's all kinds of citizen initiative that is there for survival purposes, really, that become made into a virtue of, it's seen as sort of virtuous and then adopted into policy, but usually on a really different basis. And it's a different basis both because the world around it's changing, and it's a different basis because the city the city still is looking at it as a money-saving device. And so there's this there's another moment. I mean, there's so many good pieces of this, but there's an early chapter that talks about tenants who take over their buildings and form housing cooperatives after the landlords have abandoned them. And, this is something that's actually ongoing. And the city never provided the scope of work necessary to make those actually livable spaces in the long term. So it's helping these tenants take over their buildings from landlords who have abandoned them. And then the city is itself kind of abandoning these tenants. And, I mean, I've been inside some buildings that, were in these programs, and 40 years later, they have enormous repair needs. And the city, and it's because the city never actually made these economically viable in the first place. But then there's another issue, of course, where, but let me actually, I'll shut up in a second, because I want to hear what you have to say, and I also am looking forward to the question and answer. But I guess the splitting question is this: isn't there a difference between, say, residents in the Bronx who are fixing up a local park, cleaning it up from illegal dumping, and the fabulously wealthy neighbors of Central Park who end up prompting the city to form the Central Park Conservancy? And on top of it are, include, okay, people who don't have who don't see ideologically. There's George Soros on one hand. I mean, we're talking fabulously wealthy neighbors of Central Park, and Richard Gilder on the other. But for Richard Gilder, this is a political project. It is a specifically right-wing neoliberal political project. He's a major benefactor of the Manhattan Institute, a right-wing think tank that forms the sort of brain trust of the Giuliani administration. So I'm just trying to think about, like, how do you tease out what this civic action is when it's coming from really different places in terms of class, in terms of projects, and, how do we make those distinctions? It's almost more as a historian, how do you make those distinctions? Because you sort of do sometimes more than others in the book, but as a historian, how do you think about how you should sort those distinctions out?
Yeah, no, I'll take it for granted that I will just, so I won't say it every time. I'm going to start off with every response with great question. I might not continue to say it, but inevitably that will be how I'm feeling in response to what you've posed, because these are all really, really wonderfully phrased and thoughtful questions, and I really appreciate them. So, to hone in, so I think, again, sort of distinguishing between the different examples in the book is really a critical point. And so to hone in on this example for people who haven't read the book, just the brief overview of this chapter in the book is to kind of, backstory, now many people might know that many of the parks in New York, particularly those in Manhattan, are now oftentimes all fully managed by essentially a kind of private-public public-private partnership. So these groups that exist somewhat within, but also in many ways outside of city government, that are running many parks. And the extreme example of this, as John mentioned, is the Bryant Park Corporation, that is really basically privatized Bryant Park, and that's been true for many decades. Another prominent example is Central Park Conservancy running the Central Park. And then there's sort of Madison's, I mean, really most of the major parks in especially Manhattan, although the reach of these groups goes beyond that. So it's a kind of story of how did we get to this moment? How did the parks, how did so much private influence, and especially wealthy influence in Manhattan, come to control, manage, exert influence over a public park system, a kind of quintessential municipal service? So that's the background to the chapter. So what I'm trying to do, so there's a number of actors who are, as John noted, part of this process. For me, what I'm trying to do chart a kind of change over time. One of the key roles that historians play, and to show a process that I think on the ground looks a lot more complex than it is often depicted as being. So that some of the people who were kind of early writers about something like the Central Park Conservancy, really framed it entirely as this kind of elite-driven top-down story of privatization of a park system. I am not saying that there aren't elements that are really accurate about that, but I am trying to say how if we see it simply as that, we miss a more complex process. So I begin this story with many of these kind of grassroots groups that develop, especially in the 1960s into the early 1970s, in the midst of municipal stagnation of budgets, of people really feeling like there just isn't, the parks are just rapidly declining, and that they kind of, there's this movement to flood into local parks as part of a larger kind of emphasis on volunteerism in the 1970s that really flourishes at the time. And to begin there and to chart how that process or how that sort of begins a kind of process that will end with something like the Central Park Conservancy. It is not to say that those things are equal in making those processes happening, but it is to say that I don't think that we get the Central Park Conservancy, especially at the time that we did, and especially with the reach that it has had in New York, along with these other major park groups, without there being something to a large populace of New York already knowing what it meant to feel like the city could no longer take care for its parks, right? That there was already this kind of sense that and this belief amongst many New Yorkers that the city was unable to care for parks, and that people were actually trying to do something about it, and to really show how that idea forms, spreads, develops into new kinds of projects, right? Like this odd coming together of this sort of champion of sorts of the left, George Soros, again of sorts, and Richard Gilder, this sort of true champion of more libertarian, that come together to save Central Park in the mid 1970s. And to again kind of show this larger process that's at work. So it's not to say that all those actors are equal in that process, but it is to show that we really miss something by simply looking at the kind of end result as a top-down process that speaks to how this process was able to happen in the way that it did. So.
I think I do appreciate that, and one of the things that in the book that I wrote with my colleague Maud Simonet about who cleans the park, just two quick things. One is that one thing we had to acknowledge is that even at the time that we wrote the book, I think there was something like 34,000 individual donors to the Central Park Conservancy, and that's not nothing. Right. But there's also, I guess a question then I also had about the relationship between these sort of local elites and national elites. And I think about a figure like William Simon, for example, who was he was the head of municipal lending, I believe, at Salomon Brothers, until he took a job as Treasury Secretary in the Ford administration. And he was the one pushing internally for the Ford administration to deny the city loan guarantees during the fiscal crisis. So that famous Daily News, Ford to city drop dead, it was as much Simon to city drop dead. Meanwhile, here was this dude who had made lots of money marketing the city's debt, knowing full well how precarious it was, moves over to the administration. And of course, he becomes, after that, the head of the, as part of the administration, he becomes very much implicated in the formulation of structural adjustment policies in the developing world. He then goes and leads the Olin Foundation, which was a very big, it spent down its entire endowment in the service of neoliberal policies. So he's kind of a local guy too, though, right? And so is somebody like Gilder. He's maybe more local, but there's a kind of, just the same way that the Treasury Secretary always now seems to be from Goldman Sachs. I mean, or for a while it was. There's a certain element to the story where almost the top-downness of it seems that it should be inevitable. And so how do you, I understand that you're also trying to sort of tell the bottom-up story, which is important to tell, but it's the question of calibration that I think is the thing that is going to strike most readers as both most fascinating and most potentially problematic about the analysis. But so I'd love for you to comment on that, but one more quick question, because I do want to, or one more quick observation, one more plug for the book rather, is that one of the great things that you do here is you also show how deep some of the continuities are, right? The public-private partnerships, they're not something that was invented recently. These were happening before the fiscal crisis. You don't get Peter Cooper and Stuyvesant Town and Parkchester and the one in Harlem, I'm spacing, but without MetLife, right? And but I think, so there's this thing though that you suggest, which is that the weight of the private in the public-private partnership gets heavier and more important as this process goes forward. And the public part of it is almost as supplicant. And I think it's a really interesting sort of observation that you have. Again, maybe equivocal if you look at, say, the force that the segregationist head of MetLife had when Stuyvesant Town was being developed. But nevertheless, I think is probably a point that's both well taken and worth emphasizing, that these forms themselves aren't new. And once again, I think that this is the really great thing about having a history like this, is that you really have the sensitivity of bringing the pre-crisis world through that crisis and through another crisis in the early 90s to understand how these crises transform the world around what otherwise would seem to be sort of stable institutional forms. So I wanted to just sort of plug that for those of you in the audience who are not historians. These are really good things to have in your heads.
No, thank you, John, again, and I appreciate your kind words. Yeah, and I think it just, and to speak a little bit to that, I think it has been, neoliberalism itself has been a term that is been thrown around to such an extent that it's almost really lost much meaning. And I almost didn't use it in the book because of that. Ultimately, I decided, as one does when you make these decisions about how you kind of want to situate your book, that it felt like it had enough kind of purchase for what I was describing to be able to want to put it in something like the subtitle. But it's sort of broadly describing this sort of move from private more towards the market, this kind of that really flourishes in the latter part of the 20th century. But I think historians in particular, perhaps from outside other disciplines, but the historians' work are ones that I'm more familiar with, are beginning to think a little bit more critically, I think, about what changes and what doesn't change between this period of neoliberalism and neoliberalism after the 1970s. And just to plug another recent book about this, Shaped by the State, which is an edited volume that came out a year or two ago, is also kind of a lot of the essays in that are historians who are kind of thinking about those kinds of continuity, while not collapsing them as a single period, because I think, at least from my perspective, some other people might disagree, that that's also wrong, that there's fundamental changes that take place in the latter half of the latter portion of the 20th century than the middle portion during the era of neoliberalism. So I think that's some really wonderful work, and I know more work is in the next couple of years. There's going to be more and more about this. So to the point about actors, and I know we have want to have time for Q&A, so I won't say much. I mean, this is something, again, I think it's a fair point to try to think about, how the book is wrestling with what are ultimately very different power holders and very people with, the ability to exert much greater influence on the processes that I'm describing. So I try to break this down in the introduction to sort of say I'm looking at three sets of actors. I'm really focused in part on these non-ideological kind of people who are, maybe they're grassroots activists, maybe they're in the kind of culture industry, maybe they're running a kind of educational institute or something along those lines, and their influence, and to designate that with the role that New York's mayors are playing, or to distinguish that from also the kind of complementary role that New York mayors are playing, and then to acknowledge that there's this critical third category of people who are like the Richard Gilders and the like, who really are driven by the private sector and market is a superior process, and are clear-eyed about that, and who are disproportionately coming from positions of wealth and power, or in the real estate industry as a whole is perhaps the greatest example, right? And I take your point too, that these are sort of often intersecting with people who are even outside of the city who are shaping these processes. And I will say that, I try to piece out those distinctions in the book, and to try to show both the importance of some of these non-ideologically oriented actors while acknowledging how they are simultaneously up against larger historical processes that are, shaping what they have power over, and simultaneously, being affected by people who are clear-eyed about how they might take these kinds of initiatives and orient them more towards a transformative public policy that reduces a public service in favor of the private sector and market. And just the last thing I'll say, and I try to do, so for instance, I have a book, a chapter that's on private security, and in that, as an example, I really try to show how there's this growth of, in the midst of rising crime in the late 60s and 70s, residents, again, throughout the city, in communities that are of color and white, who are really flooding into to streets to begin to patrol their neighborhoods. And that is happening simultaneous to these small scale initiatives by a couple powerful but really small initiatives of educational institutions in Morningside Heights and in businessmen in Midtown, to begin to move private security guards, which had almost always been on private property, into public streets, and to show how those things are operating together and are both important to showing how, to the point now where over time we have so many private security circulating on state streets, we sometimes don't even notice them, even though often behind the scenes they are essentially operating as a supplemental police force. So that's just to say that it's a really good point. I try to be careful with charting those processes, and I appreciate the point.
I'm sorry for neglecting that chapter in my comments, because that's actually that was a chapter I think I had most to learn from generally, and I learned a ton. And I hadn't really put any of the pieces together there, and it was wonderful to read. We do have some questions already. I encourage folks to put more questions in the question and answers, but I'm gonna go in order. We have Jeffrey Kressler, who asks, why do you characterize the political environment as social democracy rather than urban liberalism? Robert Wagner, John Lindsay, Jacob Javits were certainly urban liberals, not social democrats.
Yeah, great question. So part of that, and I think it's an important distinction. Actually, for my benefit, if we don't mind keeping the questions up there a little bit longer in the future, just so that I can monitor them, that'd be awesome. So I wanted to reference those. I'm like a visually oriented person. I take your point, and you're right. That language is in part coming from Josh Freeman, who wrote a terrific book called Working Class New York, who really categorizes mid-century New York as the kind of closest. He doesn't, if I'm remembering correctly, his language, he doesn't quite say that New York is a kind of social democracy, because you're right. It's not, especially from the mayoral, the mayors who are really having the greatest role in shaping the city, they're not social democrats. And you're absolutely right. What he is trying to show through that language is to also reflect how there's a greater influence of the city. So there's an enormously powerful municipal workforce, right? That is creating, that goes back, prior to this point, that is helping to engineer a kind of, along with municipal officials, a kind of robust, public hospital system, or CUNY being this extensive free public education system, or the subways being forced to run at a really cheap rate. That there's a wider variety of examples and a wider variety of social forces, many of them coming out of the very powerful union movement, that in combination with more liberal mayors, right, not social democrats, but more liberal mayors, who are creating, again, not a social democracy, but what in the US is probably, if you were to held up what city kind of comes closest at that time, I think that's really the point that he's making. And it's not, and he would absolutely agree with this, right? It's not to overstate this as any kind of utopia, right? I mean, we can talk about the brutal racial and class inequalities that continue to exist in mid-century New York. Absolutely needs to be foremost in our mind when thinking about that period, but it is to suggest that's where the sort of language is coming, that it's remarkable looking back, and it's remarkable in the context of even what's happening in the United States at the time, just how robust a system of public education, public hospitals, public housing, public health clinics, right, that exist in mid-century New York.
Thematically, it's actually an interesting question as well, because there almost is, you could, just as the community actors who weren't at all anticipating neoliberalism may have facilitated neoliberalism, these often liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans who didn't anticipate a kind of what was a remarkably, I think you're right, remarkable set of institutions in the US context, were they, I mean, and I think, to state Freeman more strongly, we did have something quite close to a social democratic welfare state in the city. And that didn't seem to bother some of these urban liberals. But again, within that, there were things like public-private partnerships that may also, which were probably different from the sort of, and more liberal. We've got another question, Louis Friedman, to what extent do you believe that much of what you analyze is the result of the failure of the municipal bureaucracy to efficiently deliver these services? And effectively, rather, deliver these services. You mentioned housing. Can you point to a bureaucracy that is more incompetent and dysfunctional than the housing authority? To throw more money to it would not fix the problem and be purely wasteful. Alternative methods that you write about are essential, no?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the point. And I don't talk about public housing very much in the book, because it is such a mammoth topic. I talk about it a little bit, but not much. But to go to the point that I think that you're making is that the kind of failure, or I don't know that I put it as a failure of municipal services, but at least some real limitations of municipal services in the late 60s into the 1970s as being a stimulus for a lot of the processes that I'm describing. So similar to how you're framing it, I would agree with at least the first part of what you're saying in that question, right? That the dissatisfaction in the late 1960s and early 1970s with crime, with the conditions of parks, with housing conditions, right? Things that in part because of 40 prior years of a robust kind of neoliberal, New Deal urban liberalism had created a set of expectations for the kinds of municipal services that people expected that are very rapidly seeming to come undone. And that, I should remember what the statistic is. I think I say something in the book, and I think actually this is also for those of you who read Kim Phillips Fine's Fear City, an absolutely marvelous book on the fiscal crisis in 1975. Her book on this, I think that this is maybe where I got it from, but something like in the early 1970s, like 10% of New York feels like city government is functioning well, or something like that. Maybe it's 20%. It's like it's a very small percentage. Now, I don't think that that's the full story. I think that there's a lot of reason why municipal government is having a kind of crisis at that moment. There's a retraction of federal services or federal support. There is a kind of longer history of white flight. There is, shifts in the national economy. So I don't think it's quite as simple as to say that this is simply a failure of municipal policy. But I would, agree with the point that that dissatisfaction with municipal services is part of what's driving at least the beginnings of some of these processes that I'm describing.
I would just, if I may, I would
please
chime in just to say
I want you to chime in as much as possible.
Just to say that certainly in the early period of what Ben is describing, public housing had not yet been massively disinvested in. What people identified as the real problem was private landlord abandonment.
Right.
And they didn't know how to deal with that because they hadn't had quite that problem before. And that was the really big story. I'm not going to go in order because I think Dylan's question, Dylan Gottlieb has a question that relates very much to this theme first. And that is, how would your book's grassroots story relate to the broader shift in New York City's political economy in this era, from manufacturing to services, the rise of finance, the centrifugal movement of corporate jobs throughout the region, etc.?
Yeah, so I think really, really great question. Dylan, by the way, is at work on what's going to be an absolutely phenomenal book on yuppies, especially focusing on New York and the 1980s. That is, I'm sure at some point in the coming years, going to be a must-have. So, yeah, I think that this. I don't know that I'm going to adequately answer this question, but sort of the relationship between the story that I'm telling and some of the broader shifts in New York's political economy. So I would say that they're crucial. That kind of goes back to some of the things that I was just mentioning in terms of what is undermining New York's economy at this time, right? Is it simply a failure of municipal government? Now, there's some blame to go around in terms of how the inefficiencies and issues within municipal governance in the late 60s. There's no denying that in various ways. But they're simultaneously facing this larger crisis of, again, a shift as Dylan's question is raising in things like the political economy of the city, the shift, the movement of industry, the collapse of manufacturing jobs, exactly the kind of jobs that had long provided the basis of a kind of stable blue-collar workforce that was providing jobs for new New Yorkers, immigrant populations, and the like that were coming into New York that could get these jobs and rise up, right? All of that is coming undone in the 1960s into the 70s in particular. And I think two, and Dylan, your work would probably have even more interesting to say about the simultaneous rise of finance, right? Because we see that this larger political shift, there's an argument to be made that that basis of New York's economy does in many ways get replaced by an even more vibrant kind of financial economy, along with the service economy, of course, right? Many service related jobs that just do not provide the kind of wages that those former manufacturing jobs did, right? And so I deal a little less with the rise of finance and its role and ultimately shaping some of the dynamics that are taking place in the 1980s and beyond. But luckily, there's some fantastic young historians who are working on exactly that question.
Yeah, thank you for that. And keeping in mind again, right, that the city lost something like 600,000 manufacturing jobs between 1965 and 1975. It's a massive economic displacement.
Right. You can't really overstate the importance of that. And simultaneous, I'm sorry, John, I hope I didn't cut you off, but and simultaneous to that, a kind of a removal of a simultaneous, corporate New York as a kind of corporate headquarters there's a mass corporate exodus that is following what begins with a movement of white middle-class New Yorkers out of the cities into the suburbs, a process that's in many ways facilitated by certain kinds of federal policies that are helping to make that homeownership more accessible, particularly to whites. And that then you have these corporations that are following. So the simultaneous undermining of some of that middle class basis of these kind of white collar work with the collapse of the industrial workforce is just devastating to New York's economy in the 60s and 70s. I'm sorry, John, I hope I didn't cut you off.
No, that's fine. And then that gets compounded with starting in the Nixon administration with major cuts in federal funding, not least to public housing. So it's a sort of a perfect storm in a lot of ways. And I guess speaking of perfect storms, Anna HR in the Q&A asks, how do you see the social and political effects of the COVID pandemic impacting the dynamics you identify in the neoliberal privatization of New York? I mean, that's asking a historian to look into the future and into the present, but as far as I'm concerned, who's better equipped?
I was going to ask you to answer this actually, so so please weigh in. Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I'm not going to say the typical kind of line about historians peering into the future because you did so, but I mean, one of the things, it makes me think, wow. Every time I think I have an answer to this question, the dynamic slightly changes in New York and what is happening, and I'm just not sure. So like I've had about 6 different ways to think about the answer to this question. And at the moment, I find myself kind of spinning a little bit because every dynamic that I think is beginning to play out seems to shift slightly. John, do you want to take a crack at this? Or just weigh in with your own insights about how this,
I mean, I should admit, first of all, that, all my academic work is only on New York. I'm like and then I do stuff on labor and I do stuff on welfare and do stuff on housing, but it's a fairly small circle, I have to admit. But within that, I think one of the interesting things that I've seen around housing particularly is that, there are millions of New Yorkers statewide who are still in very bad rent arrears with their landlords because the federal funds, the federal emergency rent relief funds that were for COVID are grossly inadequate. But if this were a situation in which, that obtained, say, 5 years ago, I think tenants would be in much worse straits than they are now, because the housing movement in the last 5 years or so has gotten much more energetic and much more successful, some of which has to do with and here's where the sort of scale jumping is interesting, right? Because you could think about Occupy having enabled somebody like Bernard Sanders to be taken seriously on the public stage, which was not a given by any stretch of the imagination. And his two successive campaigns re-energizing a kind of what one has to admit was a fairly moribund democratic socialist movement in the United States, which then was working with groups like the Working Families Party to change the makeup of the New York State Senate, and they did. And that had enormous consequences for the power of the real estate industry, which had coasted on having a Republican or Republican-dominated state Senate for decades. And so all of a sudden, there's a lot more rent protections for New Yorkers. Locally, there is a right to counsel in housing court. Now, the courts have just said that they're going to ignore the right to counsel in order to keep their docket going, which is itself going to be litigated. But there's a right to counsel for poor people in housing court facing eviction in New York. There wasn't that before 2018 or 20. And so one of the things I think that Ben's work actually helps point us to is that the reason that these dynamics change is that once you sort of isolate, some policy or something that's going on that might be affected by, say, COVID, you have to realize that the answer to that is going to look really different if you have in mind the sort of dynamics that might have been true before a few years ago. So I think actually there's something quite promising right now, which is weird to say, because anytime there's something promising in New York, it's also extremely dangerous. Because we could be on the cusp of a massive eviction crisis, which would be catastrophic for New York. Or we could be on the cusp of residents taking a lot more power back from very wealthy private interests that have run their lives effectively for the last 25, 30 years in more and more predatory ways. So it's an interesting moment. But, in terms of the neoliberal privatization, I guess one of the questions that might be embedded in that would be how much of the sort of long-term budget impacts, the possibility of an enormous amount of empty office space and the rents that go with them, the possibility that you have people who aren't actually working in New York anymore because they're telecommuting. How would that change? And I'll throw this back to you, Ben. When you think about those kinds of dynamics, do you see that this sort of throws us back into sort of permanent fiscal crisis and then justifies the kind of privatization response? Or are there grounds to be more optimistic?
Yeah, I think that obviously it does remain to be seen, and I'll reiterate some of what I said earlier, in that the dynamic is changing so quickly that it's hard to get a sense of things. But I'll echo some of the things that you said, right? So there have been various moments where it seemed like the situation would be utterly catastrophic, and I think that because of the dynamics that you have described, I think that there is a lot of hope that, especially around housing, but housing means so much for everything else that happens in New York, that we're seeing actually more positive, or we're seeing a lot of reasons to be hopeful. I think of another example, the empty hotels that are in the outer boroughs, like that sort of the conversation so quickly shifted from the idea that those might be converted to kinds of supportive housing for houseless people as being something that was just kind of like this almost seeming like pipe dream, and becoming something that was actually being talked about as, not that that's a real solution to homelessness, but it's a step forward. And going from something that was actually being kind of talked about as a real possibility. That's a far way off from really happening, but I think that reflects exactly some of the kind of dynamics that you're describing. I'll say one element of this too is and I'm still really thinking through all the ways that I feel about this. I think it's really complex, but I think that what you're describing is a reflection of there too, that a lot of the sort of broader left has, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, kind of gone back towards pressuring the state. And there was going back a little bit further than that, there was a real dynamic, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll wrap things up, but there was a real dynamic within the left to not engage the state, to emphasize things like mutual aid projects that were, trying to not really change policy, but build up alternatives. A lot of wonderful work was done with that. That work continues. It's important and it's vital, and it provides a lot of direct services on the ground for people that are in need. It's really important. But I think on some of these bigger questions, like housing policy, homelessness, climate change, you are not going to solve those problems with mutual aid projects. You're just not. And so to see an orientation within exactly what you're describing around housing, to see a growing grassroots housing movement, to have officials who seem to actually be responsive to that movement and then sometimes come out of that movement and are accountable to that movement to create the kind of change that will lead New York City in what I think is more positive directions, has been extraordinary. And I think it is a lot of dynamics at work, but I think one of them is that sort of shift in orientation amongst a broader left in New York towards going back to a kind of re-engagement with emphasizing an engagement and pressuring on the state.
Thank you. We're out of questions. Peter, I think I'll hand it over to you, but just before doing so, just to thank you, Ben, for both such a great book and some really good conversation.
And I'll just jump in really quickly to say thank you so much on some really fantastic questions, and thank you all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you, and great questions of the audience. Thank you.
I wanted to say congratulations, Ben, on what is a really fantastic book. Some of the folks that have been watching have been writing to say that they've already ordered a copy. I encourage the rest of you to do so as well. This video will be on YouTube soon, so I hope you see a windfall soon. It's truly a great contribution to literature. I've learned a lot from it as well. John, I will echo Ben saying that, as I expected, very thoughtful questions tonight, and thank you for joining us. And for everyone at home, I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you so much for joining. And the next event at the Gotham Center will be on April 4th. The title, which I should know offhand, How the British Lost America, NYC and the Years of Militarism. So I hope to see you all there. The link is in the chat below. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Peter.